had a happy childhood. I might as well admit it. And I was at the Key West Literary Festival in one January when they have different themes, and the theme was memoir that year. I call it the January Dip in Airfares Literary Festival. But before I went, I thought, well, all these memoirists are going to gather in memoirs bars and talk about all their childhood and all kinds of incest and bestiality and grandma's sniffing glue and it's going to be embarrassing for me because I don't have any awful secrets to. And I can imagine myself in a bar, and they talk about all these awful things of other children, and they say, "Do you have any secrets in your childhood?" I said, "Well, the only secret I could think of was my collie dog, Chubby. We had a collie, a little puppy named Chubby, when I was about 3 or 4. My sister, Suki the Oppressor, was about 5. And Chubby was rather sickly, and then one day Chubby disappeared. And we said to our parents, "Where's Chubby?" And said, "Well, Chubby was not doing well here and was sickly, and we gave him to some friends on a farm. He can gamble in the sunshine with the other animals and be happy." And so I didn't think much about it until about some years later. I was home from college, and Chubby's name came up at dinner one night, and I said, "Why didn't we ever visit Chubby at the farm?" And Suki the Oppressor said, "There wasn't any farm, you dummy. Chubby had to be put down." And I said, "Chubby's gone?" and my mother said, "Well, Chubby would probably be gone in any case because collies don't live 18 or 20 years or anything like that." And I said, "Yeah, but why am I just finding out now?" And my father said, "It's not our fault you're slow on the uptake." And so I wrote about this somewhere, and then about a week later, after it was published, I got a call from Suki. She said, "The collie was not called Chubby. The collie was called George." She said, "You were called Chubby." So I'm in the atrocity arms race of memoir. I start way back.
Of course, all this took place in Kansas City. Kansas City, I've never been there, but it seems to have sort of like this wholesome image. I mean, you don't hear of a lot of things happening in Kansas City, but it seems to be like an okay American city.
More than that. I mean, yeah, okay, it's superior.
Well, it has a jazz scene like New Orleans.
Yeah, had a jazz scene, or the jazz scene is kind of fittered out by the time I was growing up, but it did have a jazz scene, and it's what the real estate people would call equally convenient to either coast. And I find that usually when I talk to somebody during the question period, someone says, "I'm from Kansas City," and I always say, "Not to doubt you, sir, but a lot of people claim to be from Kansas City who aren't, just for the prestige." And there was one today, I met one today, and he said, "I'm from Independence." Independence was next to Kansas City. It was sort of now, I guess he's from Kansas City, kind of subsumed into Kansas City. But no, it's a great place. I had a happy childhood. What can I say? But just keep it to yourselves.
Well, On a sadder note, the last time you were here, Alice was with you. And at the time, she had written, I think it was a magazine, like a journal article, about her experience with cancer, and I think it had gone into remission. I remember hearing the article. It was a beautiful article, and she was able to talk frankly about that.
Yeah, it was in the New England Journal of Medicine, which is what a New York literary agent would call a hard book to crack, particularly if you're not a doctor. She wrote another book. We had a friend whose child was diagnosed with a malignant tumor in his chest when he was about 11, 12. And Alice wrote him a letter because she had just been through similar stuff. And about, I think it was 18 years later, his mother found the letter or came across the letter, and that was published as a little book called Dear Bruno, which Ed Koren illustrated. And it included a letter from Bruno saying he was sorry he hadn't answered sooner, but he had been doing various things. So it was an encouraging book. And Alice sort of quoted one of the doctors saying, getting cancer when you're young and haven't smoked or anything like that is sort of like walking underneath a window where a flower pot falls and hits you on the head, and the only thing to do is just to push it away and try to keep going, which Bruno did. He's fine now.
Well, I remember when she was here, she was on the panel, and sometimes in putting together panels for a festival, like you have these different people and you have to kind of cut and stitch panels together. And I was asked to moderate a panel of people who live with problems in their lives, and Alice was on there talking about her battle with cancer. There was another woman who had been raised on a plantation with a wicked aunt, and another woman who was from Puerto Rico. Right? And so it's trying to kind of like combine these three, and it actually worked. But of course, Alice was the star of it. But I remember a point that she made, that one thing that I'm concerned about her is that with your two daughters, she said she never had any doubt that you'd be a good father. She said she was concerned about you being able to match the sneakers.
Yeah, she thought I would forget dental appointments and stuff, and I said in the book I wrote about the problem wasn't that. The problem was finding someone. Excuse me, just a minute. Anyway, we had different views of disease. I recently they found some macular degeneration in one of my eyes, and the treatment for this is stabbing you in the eye. The doctor preferred to call it an injection. It sounded like a stabbing to me, and the first time he did it, he said, "Are you uncomfortable about this?" And I said, "No. I would ask two things of you. One is that you don't take a running start from across the room." And he said, "Okay, we'll do that." And two, that you don't make that noise that Tony Perkins made in Psycho. So I'm okay with that now.
Now she was one of your books was about Alice. Let's go eat.
Right.
And so did she travel with you? Did you go and did y'all experience food? Did y'all comment on it, or was just?
Yeah, she actually knew something about food. I don't know anything about food. I mean, I don't cook, and I don't know what a proper beef Wellington is supposed to taste like or anything like that. And so I wrote about food mainly as a way to write lighter pieces about something else or to make jokes. And Alice she was more knowledgeable about food, and also more sensible. And I always complained that she had a weird predilection for holding our family to 3 meals a day. but she had a broad interpretation of what constituted an hors d'oeuvre. So, yeah, a lot of the food books were just sort of had to do with family and like I think maybe the first piece I did for the New Yorker about eating was the Brobridge Crawfish Festival, which or it may have been about. And so Brobridge Crawfish Festival was really about Cajuns, and when in the time before they became briefly fashionable, and people sort of unaware of Cajuns and had them mixed up with people in the New Orleans and things. And the first one might have been about Cincinnati chili. I don't know. Cincinnati, as you may know, is a place where people think chili is made by Macedonians and and served on spaghetti and can be ordered by number in various ways. So I wasn't interested, like what my daughters sometimes call grown-up food writers. Wasn't interested in whether Skyline chili was better than Empress chili or something, but just the fact that the people had to leave Cincinnati and be drafted or something before they found out that people ate chili in a different way, and it wasn't always made by Macedonians. And it's just sort of like people raised in Nevada have to go somewhere else and find out that filling stations don't always have slot machines in them.
But, people in New Orleans didn't always eat crawfish, at least certainly not the way that they did. I mean, there was a time when I was a kid, if you were invited to like a seafood outing, it'd be a shrimp boil. And crawfish was just regarded as like a junk food. Nobody really ate it. It was really kind of like in the 70s that it started becoming popular. I think once shrimp became rather expensive, but it's fairly new on the palate level.
Well, and there weren't Cajun restaurants. There was one. Was it the Bon Ton or some?
Bon Ton, yeah.
That was, and of course Cajun. People made fun of Cajuns in New Orleans. It was like a rube or a Yahoo, it wasn't fashionable to be a Cajun. But crawfish, and the same. I mean, that was true in New England and in Nova Scotia, where I live in the summer. The lobster used to be. They used to say if you brought a lobster sandwich to school for lunch, it showed you were poor. So things change.
I know one place that's been a favorite of yours that you've written about, and I think you visited again this weekend, is Moscow's.
Yeah, I was there. Well, I'd been in town for a couple hours before I went there. I think I was talking to somebody today about it. I think the first time I went was when I was here for the school integration, which was 1960 or something, and it was dark out there, but at that time, I mean, and there wasn't much development, and I remember going with a friend, and he put one of the people with us in the back seat, looking to the left, so he could see the beer sign of Moscow's to know where to make the U-turn to come back. Then we always ordered the same thing at Moscow's. I've been ordering the same thing for 50 or 60 years. And it's very simple. The other night, we just said, okay, we need cracked crab salad, we need spaghetti bordelaise and oysters Moscow, we need the shrimp, we need the chicken Le Grande and the sausage. And one of the people who was there said he'd come in a couple of months ago and gave that order, and the waitress said, "Oh, you want a number one?" But Betty Jo told us that was a little joke from the waitress. The other thing I learned about Moscow's when doing the piece is that it's not Moscow's, it's Moscow's. And nobody in New Orleans says Moscow, but the family says Moscow. I slipped into Moscow there by mistake.
Now, didn't you once do an article, maybe for the New Yorker, nominating Mama Muska for the Nobel Prize?
Yes, they did. And they gave it to Kissinger that year.
See, that's that East Coast bias.
Yeah. Yeah, I couldn't understand that. I guess they had never had her baked oysters. I got in trouble with Kissinger, not with Kissinger himself, but I said at one point that why is it that George Shultz, a former Republican Secretary of State with a PhD, is always referred to as Mr. Shultz, and Henry Kissinger, a former Republican Secretary of State with a PhD, is always called Dr. Kissinger. And the only thing I could figure is that Kissinger has a podiatry practice on the side.
So how did you find the food at Muska's this weekend?
It's quite edible.
Is it pretty much what you,
Yeah,
is it pretty much what you remember from the
Yeah,
past?
they don't vary a lot at Muska's. Although every time I'm there, I'm usually there with a bunch of people because it's a good place to order kind of Chinese or family style or whatever you call it. And every time somebody brings up, you know, it's amazing because they really have good steaks here. And I said, and so have you ever had the quail? Someone said the other night. No, nobody's ever had the quail. So we talk about these things, but we still order a number one every time we go there.
Speaking of Chinese, didn't you just recently write a poem or something about, in
I
good
did.
humor and with the best of wishes, just kind of talking about different Chinese foods in different parts of China? And
Thank you for not calling me a racist.
okay.
Yeah, I wrote a poem in the New Yorker about a sort of wannabe foodie who was worried that he was eating in the wrong province Chinese restaurant, that he was still eating Cantonese when he should have been eating Szechuan, and then he should have been eating Hunan, and he should have been eating this. And everything went on fine for a couple of weeks, and then somebody wrote a piece somewhere saying that I was yearning for a white America and was a racist, and I can't remember some other thing I was called. And then a number of people said that apparently a lot of these people had apparently missed the class in middle school where the English teacher tells you that the author of the poem is not the protagonist of the poem. They're two different people. But you know, so there's kind of a hoo-ha for a few days. Fortunately, I'm not on social media, but my son-in-law would occasionally say, "Well, everybody now says the guy's stupid or whatever." And then I wrote a piece in the New Yorker about a Trumpian candidate entering the race and accusing Trump of wearing a corset, and someone at the New Yorker said, aren't you worried you're going to be attacked as somebody who's done body shaming or something like that? And it said, you know, it lasts for a couple days. They don't take your house. They don't freeze your bank account. If someone wants to rant on the internet or on social media, let them rant, particularly since I'm not on there. Or I to quote Mrs. Mosca, Mama Mosca, to, I believe it was Walter Isaacson when he worked for the Times-Picayune and doing his story on Mosca's, I don't care what you write because I can't read.
You also did a commentary one time, it may have been more of a rant from traveling around the nation and seeing a lot of places serving, a lot of banquets you went to, and that the common dish was chicken a la king.
Chicken a la king, this country was once afloat in chicken a la king. I'm sure most of you aren't old enough to remember this, but you would go, I went, as Errol said, a lot of times when I did a piece for the New Yorker every 3 weeks somewhere in the country for 15 years, and occasionally I'd go to someplace like a Kiwanis club to see what business people were thinking about it. And the Kiwanis Club always had chicken a la king. And in fact, I knew this Kiwanis song by then, and I made up a verse. There's nothing can defeat us, whatever life may bring, because we can go and eat us some chicken a la king. And I claim that chicken a la king was a multi-regional, multi-class dish because in college I used to go to these debutante parties, and I know you're thinking, what is he doing at a debutante party? Well, if you had a tux and a pulse, and you were male, you could go to the debutante parties. And this would be on the North Shore of Long Island or someplace like that. And about midnight, they would have what they called supper. This is 7 or 8 hours after everybody in Kansas City had had supper. But we tried to get people fed before dark in Kansas City. And these waiters would come out with these big silver bowls, and in the silver bowls would be chicken a la king. Not quite as good as Kiwanis chicken a la king, but chicken a la king. And in fact, there's a theory that chicken a la king, that goop the chicken a la king floats around in, if it comes in contact with silver, particularly silver that's been in the family for more than 3 generations, can cause the teeth to bind together. And that's why those people talk like this. I don't believe that theory because the Kiwanis Club doesn't talk like that, but they don't have silver bowls. I never thought of that.
But I think you also offer, as I recall, a theory that is people travel around the rural areas of the country, especially the Midwest, and they see all those silos, that the silos were...
Yeah, because I always wondered what those silos were filled with. And so you figure there's a silo that's got nothing but hula hoops in it. I mean, it's stuff that used to be very valuable. And then one silo is just full of Nehru jackets. And a silo full of chicken a la king. Thank you.
I don't know if you remember, once you were on a panel here at this festival several years ago, and it was distinguished food writers, and the question was asked, what?
Me?
Yeah, well, you can see how you distinguish yourself right here. The question was asked to the panel, what is the most unusual food you've ever eaten? And your answer was deer penis.
Well, yeah. No, you're close to the right story. I was in Hong Kong, and we went into a restaurant feeling rather adventurous. And one of the things on the menu was double-boiled deer penis. And I did almost order it, but I was afraid when he brought it to the table, I would take a look and say, why don't you go back and have him boil it one more time? So I didn't actually eat that. But a friend of mine said that General Stuyvesant, who was behind the lines in China during the Second World War, and the food got very scarce, and they offered him deer sphincter, no fawn sphincter. And he said, I'd rather starve, and almost did.
Let me ask you a little bit about New York. You've lived in the Village just pretty much all of your adult life, haven't you?
Well, you're very close to the truth. I used to live in the Village. My house is in the same place. My house hasn't moved. But the real estate people decided that there was a West Village, which is more fashionable than the Village. So I now prefer to say I live in the West Village. I got a free upgrade. No miles, nothing. Yeah, the Village. Well, when I first got to New York, I remember I said, people walking around in New York, about 10, in any other city, about 10% of them would be either interviewed or arrested. But in New York, they just seem regular. And that's certainly true in the village, which I think people from the Midwest, and this has been true for years, I think feel more comfortable in a place like that because it's low rise and you can see the sun. And to somebody who grew up in the Midwest, even if if you're told all kinds of unnatural acts are going on in the village, there'd be nothing more unnatural than going to your house on an elevator, in an elevator. I mean, it just seems kind of weird. So I now describe myself as a resident out-of-towner. And my girls grew up in the village. And in fact, one of them at one point said, "Why do you tell people that we're from Kansas City? If I was born in New York and lived in New York," and I said, "An American diplomat's child who's born in Paris is not French. You happened to be born while we were staying in New York." And in the book about my father, I mentioned that if you listen to people talk about their childhood, you can often see a theme emerge, like we come from a noble family, you must never do anything to besmirch its name, or we're miserable because your father deserted us, or something like that. And I realized that the theme I wanted while my kids were growing up was, despite all evidence to the contrary, you're being raised in Kansas City.
But how is New York, the city, doing? Is it still the same city that you've remembered and liked all your life? Or?
Well, it's being changed, and I think partly by real estate. I think it's being changed, and I'm not certainly an expert in this or even knowledgeable of this, but just from outside, it seems like it's being changed so that it'll be something like you read Paris is, where only rich people can live in the city, and everybody else has to live out somewhere, because the real estate is becoming so that people can't live there, so if that happens, of course, inner city will now mean rich people. So to say, there was a very fancy ball with a lot of inner city people there. I like that. Or, to some extent, the kind of one neighborhood after the other gets sort of transformed, or gentrified, or whatever you want to call it. And then the real estate people, I mean, the rapacity of the New York real estate people is just beyond belief. The High Line, which is a wonderful thing now in New York, which is an old railroad built, and you can see all the city. But now, of course, in the higher part of the more uptown part of the High Line in the 30s, they built buildings next to the High Line which say something like High Line Arms or access to the High Line condos only $3 million, and so you're walking in a tunnel. So the High Line's no longer the High Line, and I think the real estate is, and of course, although that's true everywhere. A friend of mine years ago moved to California, and he said, "Oh, it's a different life. You just sit there in a hot tub. It's great, no clothes." And I said, "What do people with no clothes in a hot tub discuss?" He said, "Real estate." Pretty much it.
Have you seen Hamilton?
I have, yeah. I happened to be sitting next to a guy who was the artistic director of the Public, where it started at some event, and he said, "Have you seen Hamilton?" And I said, innocently, "I understand it's hard to get tickets," I said. And so he said, "Call my secretary." I thought it was wonderful. I would say that it changed my view about hip hop, except I didn't have a view to start with. I did sort of had opted out of that one, but I think it's brilliant. And also, it's done great things when my grandsons were in New York after seeing Hamilton. They wanted to see where Hamilton, because where they brought Hamilton after Aaron Burr shot him and all that. And a couple of places in the village that I think when you think about doing something that entertaining, drawn from a really serious piece of history and biography, I think it's great. And I think the guy is really brilliant. And I hear the person who replaced him in acting in it is just as good.
I don't guess it still works to call that guy secretary for tickets anymore.
What?
I don't guess it still works to call that secretary for tickets.
He said no out of towners. He said.
I'd mentioned that I wanted to talk a little bit about the news media, and you said no. That's the one thing I don't know anything about because it changes so much. But that said, let me at least ask you to talk. I mean, you've worked for some prestigious magazines, so like magazine like the New Yorker. Has that changed over the years in terms of what they look for, the kind of assignments you get writing for them?
Well, I think the New Yorker has changed in that it's changed with the times, partly. It has, well, when you think about it, when I got to the New Yorker, there was no table of contents of the New Yorker. The bylines were only existed with at the end of the piece. And the pieces often were 2-part pieces or even 3 or 4-part pieces. And so there was an assumption that people could thumb through it and see what they liked, and more time, I think. I think now the New Yorker is more on the news than it used to be. More likely to be breaking stories or doing Washington reporting, things like that. The Washington Reporter for the first 20 or 30 years I was there, I can't remember. I might have mentioned my daughters when they say, when did that happen? I'd say, 15 or 20 years ago. It's usually 40. Richard Rovere wrote these wonderful kind of graceful things that are sort of commentary, and now it would be more hard reporting, and the pieces aren't as long. And the magazine, I mean, of course, magazines now are kind of shifting over to digital. So that part's different. And I think the New Yorker is more run in a more rational way than it was when I first got there. I always said that if somebody from the Harvard Business School or McKinsey and Company or somebody came and studied the New Yorker in those days, they would have said it can't come out next week. This won't work, because basically all the decisions were made by Sean, by one man. Now it's more, people have more obvious assignments. There was a guy at the New Yorker when I first got there, and one of the writers, Richard Harris, offered a 2-week vacation in Jamaica for anybody who would figure out what he did. And occasionally, we had drawing accounts then sometimes, and occasionally you'd get a little chit in the inter-office mail that said, we have credited you with so much for breakage. I thought, well, if I broke something, why would they give me money instead of, so I didn't say anything. My theory about how the accounting department was run, there was a room full of ancient female Jesuits who did this with quill pens. I think for years and years, to get an outside line at the New Yorker, you say, "Hi, Betty," could I have an outside line? You didn't dial 9 or anything like that. So yeah, it's kind of modernized in a way, and then of course it's thinner now because advertising in magazines has gone way down.
I maintain there can only be one New Yorker, and it can only be in one place, and that's in New York. I mean, it takes a city with that size and reputation to support a magazine like that. It couldn't work anywhere else.
Well, however, I haven't looked into this for years, but years ago, the center of subscriptions to New Yorker was somewhere around Illinois or something. I mean, there's an awful lot of. I don't think the readership is necessarily in New York, but the people doing it are. Yeah, I think. And it used to be. I guess that's how a lot of us ended up in New York. That if you wanted to work for a magazine or something, that's where you went. And that was before cities started to get their own magazines.
Now, you also do poetry for the nation.
Thank you for calling it poetry. Well, this was an arrangement with. I used to do a column for the Nation. At that point, then the editor of the Nation was a man I always refer to as the wily and parsimonious Victor S. Navasky, and we went to lunch when he took over the Nation, and he said he wanted me to do a column, and I said, I hate to bring this up, but how much are you paying for something like a column? And he said, well, we've been paying something in the high 2 figures. And I said, the high 2 figures? He said, we've been paying 65 usually. And that sounds like the middle 2 figures to me. So I turned it over to my high-powered literary agent, Robert Slowly Lesher. And I said, play hardball. And so he got him up to 100. So I was making $100 a column. And a couple of months after it started, Navasky came to me and said, what about these quotes? And I said, what quotes are you talking about? And he said, did John Foster Dulles really say you can't fool all the people all the time, but you might as well give it your best shot? I said, Victor, at these rates, you can't expect real quotes. So then when I switched to doing the column for a newspaper syndication, I wrote a poem. And, it all came about because of John Sununu, who was George H.W.'s chief of staff for Raw, and a very arrogant man who always wanted to show he was the smartest guy in the room. And he had this great name, Sununu. I love that name. And so I used to kind of mumble it on the subway, Sununu, Sununu. And so I wrote a poem called "If You Knew What Sanu Knew," and so I sent it to the Nation, and Navasky said, "How would you feel about doing one of these poems every issue?" And I said, well, I hate to bring up this subject. I know you tend to break out in hives when money is discussed, but how much are you going to pay me? And he said, well, I said a poem is shorter than a column. But we will pay you $100 a poem. And it didn't sound like a lot. But then I sort of looked into it and realized at that point the highest paid outlet for poetry in the country was the New Yorker. They paid $10 a line. Poetry was paid for by the line, or is still, I think. And so I figured, and you can see by the $10 a line why there's not a big crowd in front of the poetry booth at the Career Day Fair. But I figured if I wrote a 2-line poem, I would be the highest paid poet in the country, and because that'd be $50 a line. So I said, okay, and I started writing. Occasionally, when I wanted to get that buzz you get for working at the absolute top dollar in your field, I'd write a 2-line poem. During the George W. Bush campaign, when his college transcript was revealed, to no effect on the campaign at all, I wrote a 2-line poem that was obliviously on he sails, with marks not quite as good as quails. And $50 a line. And when Lloyd Benson, the former Texas senator, was named Secretary of the Treasury, I said a poem that was called Lloyd Benson's Relations with Special Interest Group. And it was, the man is known for pro quo quidness. In Texas, that's how folks do business. And I could write a 4-line poem, get $25 a line still during the campaign for, just trying to think, oh yeah, it was Mitt Romney. I said, oh, Mitt's so smooth of speech and smooth of garb, he reminds us all of Ken and Barbie, so quick to shed his moderate regalia, he may, like Ken, be lacking genitalia. It's $25 a line. So I'm still doing that. I have to say that Alice threw me a 60th birthday party in Moscas, and one of the guests was the wily and parsimonious Victor S. Navasky. And we had that big room, the main room in Moscas, except there were 2 or 3 non-party people still there. And as we left, one of them approached Navasky and said, you're the editor of The Nation, right? And he said, right. I said, I'm your only Louisiana subscriber. He's very proud. So I still do. Sometimes I say every week, but it's not really every week, because I mentioned once in a column that The Nation is published only every other week in the summer, even though the downtrodden are oppressed every day of the year. They don't care. Get to the beach.
We just have a few minutes left, but one other topic I want to talk on is travel writing you've done. Could you just mention like a favorite exotic destination that you've been to?
Kansas City's not eligible for that, right?
A place with palm trees, preferably.
Well, I spent 2 weeks once in, I wouldn't call it favorite, in Nauru, the Republic of Nauru, which is in the South Pacific, and in that time you had to, it was almost unnecessary to say spend 2 weeks in Nauru, because if you went to Nauru, you had to spend 2 weeks because the plane only went every 2 weeks. They called it the statutory fortnight in Nauru. And Nauru was an island that was pushed up from the sea by bird guano, and it was very rich phosphate. And so the way you mine phosphate is not to like make a little hole in the ground and go, you just take the whole thing, take everything, and leave these coral pinnacles. So it was sort of disappearing as it was being enriched, which I found very interesting. And of course, you couldn't grow anything, except there was a Chinese restaurant in Nauru, because a lot of the Nauruans didn't work in the mines. They had contract workers from the Gilbert and Ellice Islands and from China, and somehow the Chinese grew something, and they had a Chinese restaurant called Star Twinkles, And I think this is amazing that the guy who was the chief civil servant in Nauru was a former British colonial officer named Q.V. Weston. And he had a theory that the overseas Chinese were a superior race, and they could do anything. And I'm sort of against theories about race being one thing or another, even if it's a good thing. But growing vegetables and having a Chinese restaurant in Nauru, I thought was a fantastic accomplishment. They were passed up for the Peace Prize that year also. Kissinger got it.
One other thing, what is your favorite restaurant in New Orleans? I mean, in New York.
Well, it's hard to say because there are different kinds of restaurants. I live in the West Village as opposed to the Village, and there are a lot of restaurants within walking distance. And I find myself, if someone writes up a restaurant, I read from the bottom to see where they are. If it's on East 64th or West 70th, I quit reading. Because I generally walk to restaurants. So my favorite restaurants in New York would just about all be in my neighborhood, plus Chinatown, of course, where I yearn for a white America.
Okay, we're going to take a few minutes for questions, if you don't mind, and we'll go from there.
Have a mic
hand,
coming
and
around?
then she'll come with the microphone.
Raise your hand. Is it here? Right here?
Yeah, right here.
There's a rumor going about on the Google that you have a grandson who's a budding political cartoonist.
Well, this is one of the few things on Google you will read that's actually true. My grandson, I have two grandsons. This is the younger one, is 11, and he liked to draw. And he started out drawing things like NFL logos and things like that, kind of copying things. But he got very interested in the political race in 16. And so he started doing cartoons. And then he put his cartoons on Instagram under the, I don't know what you call that on Instagram, the site or the name of anti.trump.cartoons. And he's now got 15,000 followers. He's remained humble. But it gives you some idea of what happens on the internet. I suspect he has more because he was probably in that march in New York and is handing out. He's got cards, but I'm not sure if I have one of the cards. It'd be hard to see from here, but he has cards. Oh yeah, here's my last card. There's Donald Trump. He's very good at Trump. He does good oranges.
Yeah. We'll just put here if anybody wants to walk by and see
Yeah,
it
we put
right
we
after.
keep
Okay.
it right there.
Okay.
Anybody else?
All right, over here.
You got that? Good.
It's him.
Thank you. We've really enjoyed this. I'm old enough to remember Chicken a la King. And to prove it, I did my student teaching in Kansas City, Missouri at
did what?
Manual High School, right across from Westport.
I'm sorry, where was it?
Manual High School,
Oh, yes, I
right
remember
across from
Manual.
Westport.
Yeah.
Would you share some of your high school experience in Kansas City, and have you ever written about civil rights in Kansas City?
I have written about civil rights in Kansas City and was allowed back grudgingly, I think, during a fair housing ordinance once years ago. I went to a school, I got out of high school the year before the Supreme Court decision, and Missouri was legally segregated, although I had no idea of that. But you know, the Brown versus Board of Education, the Brown was from Topeka, Kansas. It was merged with other from the South. So I've written a little bit. My high school had kind of all aspects of white society. I don't know if you've ever read a book called Mrs. Bridge, which was mentioned in a column by Meg Wolitzer in the Times a couple of weeks ago. It's a perfect novel. There was a movie with Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward that combined Mrs. Bridge and Mr. Bridge. Now, those were people who had siblings at the day school, at the private schools, which in our day was Pembroke Country Day was the boys' school. It was called Pem Day. We, of course, called people who went there Pemsy Daisies. And then we had people from a place called Waldo, which was, I think, a little sort of redneck town that Kansas City had sort of grown out and enveloped. They were called Waldonians. And we didn't have enough ethnic people to go around. So the guy who was called Guinea Gessler, who kept insisting he was Swiss, I finally realized he really was Swiss. The guy we called Dogbite Dunlap, Alice said, "You called him Dogbite Dunlap?" I said, "Yeah." I said, why was that? And I said, "Well, when he was a little boy, he got bit by a dog and he was missing half of one of his ears." I said, "What was his real name?" She said, "Surely you didn't always call him Dogbite." I said, "No, sometimes we called him boy with 1 1/2 ear." So it's a typical American high school. And then, of course, Kansas City did almost everything wrong on trying to desegregate the schools. Plus, they had state line so close that you could move into Johnson County and what Richard Rhodes called Cupcake Land and avoid desegregation. So they really messed it up. I have to say that, even though in every other way my hometown is perfect.
Okay. Another question? All right. Right up here, please. Okay, I'll just repeat. The question is, of all of his books, does he have a personal favorite?
No, it's hard because they're so different. I guess the book about Alice was a personal favorite in a way, but then I like the book about killings. That it's totally different, and as you heard, my publisher would say he's very versatile. And the other way to look at that is I never got my act together, and so it's sort of apples and oranges.
By the way, there are some copies of Killing over in the little bookstore over there. Any other questions? Okay, let's go. Got 2 more. Okay.
Thank you. The piece you wrote about Kenny Shopson's lamented restaurant is an all-time favorite. It almost has a surreal quality. And I'm wondering, since then, have you experienced a restaurant or a restaurateur as idiosyncratic as Kenny Shopson?
No, I think this Ken Shopson's restaurant was sui generis. This was a restaurant near my house that had been a corner store, what we call in New York a corner store, like a bodega. And he had gradually, then he would sell sandwiches too, or as he put it, he would push mayonnaise in various forms. And then he turned it into a restaurant, which had 30 seats and 900 items on the menu. And the whole time I went there for years and years, I never heard of him running out of anything. And he had sort of weird things, like he and his son made up a country. I think it was called Malokia. And they had something like Malokia shortbread or something. I mean, somebody from local neighborhood paper or something said he was writing a piece about Shopsons. Could he interview me? And I said, you know, I've insulted most of the people I've worked for on the record, but now you're talking serious stuff. We could be banned from there. We could be 86, as we say in New York. So I'm going to have to be very careful what I tell you, and also I'm going to have to tell Kenny everything that I tell you. He said, fine. So Kenny said, okay, so what do you ask? I said, well, he wanted to know what an Egyptian burrito was. He said, well, what'd you tell him? I said, it's a burrito, and inside is sort of what Kenny thinks people in Egypt might eat. He said, well, that's accurate. But he had a lot of rules in the restaurant, and one of them was you can't order what somebody else ordered. Like you'd say, it's the person at the table next to you, what is that? And he said, that's an Egyptian burrito. I said, oh, the waitress comes and say, I'd like Egyptian burrito. No copying. You're not allowed to copy. And he threw people out a lot, particularly if they looked like they were from uptown. And so it was they've moved twice, and they're now in the Essex Market in the Lower East Side, a smaller place. And Kenny mainly sits and pontificates. One of his sons does most of the cooking. But the spirit is the same, I think.
Yeah, I think we have time, just maybe one, perhaps two questions. Yes, sir. Wait, hold up. Wait, good, Mike.
Whether or not, my question is whether or not you have a point of view, or whether your acquaintances in New York City have a point of view as to how or why Donald Trump came from New York. And if he had come from Kansas City, would he have been rejected out of hand?
I'm not sure how long he was in that. The New York real estate business, I think, is not matched for, as I say, viciousness or rapacity or willingness to do anything for a buck in any other city. I mean, I'm not an expert on the real estate market, but there was a time I remember writing years ago when Donald Trump was quoted as saying that the other owners in the basketball league, I think, was it the basketball league or the football league that he had a place in, and he went broke or he left. He said the other owners were a bunch of schmucks, and that was written down somewhere. And then he said he didn't say that. He never used that word. And I wrote a column, and I said, if he's been in the New York real estate business for 20 years and never used the word schmuck, he has a restraint that he wasn't credited for. I think we couldn't have produced something like that. I just read today or something. He's been in something like 3,000 lawsuits. How many bankrupts? All this stuff. I think at some point, I don't think he wouldn't have been the size. I don't think he could boast as much if he were a thing. So he's a product of New York, although I think snotty New Yorkers say he's a product of the boroughs. And I mean, both the Kushners and the Trumps sort of moved in from New Jersey, and that's that building that has caused Jared Kushner so much trouble, the 666 Fifth Avenue, which is an ugly building. When it was built, Henry Geldzahler, who was an art curator, said it looked like the box that the Seagram's building came in. but that was all to move to New York, to be a big shot in New York, I think we produced him, and of course in New York, you know, people were more shocked than they were in the rest of the country that he could be president.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.